So we say hello and welcome to all who are here and all who are eavesdropping on the internet. Sarah, you know who you are. We have a family in Los Angeles is watching today. Billy did a reading about interdependence. And it's one of the interesting ironies of our existence, in that if we go back far enough in human history, some 6,000 to 8,000 years perhaps in some locations, all of humanity was indigenous folk, right? The people were indigenous to the area that they inhabited. And the archaeological record shows that for most of these folk, interdependence was the natural state of being. They lived in small communities or tribes or bands. And within that community or band or tribe, there were some kind of accepted norms of behavior that ruled the day. And one of the norms of behavior was that no member of the group is dispensable. Everyone has value. And in that valuing everyone, then it was up to the elders or the shaman to determine what the function of each individual might be within that group, based on how the elders or the shaman read the energy signature and the perhaps past life history of the individual involved. And so even those who were mentally ill, who had different proclivities around anything that humans do as opposed to the norm of the group, those people were just seen as special and were given special opportunities to serve the community. And so in reality, Karl Marx was many, many centuries behind the times. Because in those communities, everyone contributed in the way they were most able to contribute. And everyone then was provided with their basic needs. That's interdependence. And then history changed. Human population grew. In many cases, hunter-gatherer cultures began to hunt and gather out their environment, their natural capital, if you will, being the wildlife, the flora and fauna of the area. Perhaps not, they began to see that perhaps was not going to be sufficient to support the population that was growing. Somewhere along the way, somebody got the ingenious idea of taking seeds from plants and actually consciously creating areas to plant and cultivate those seeds. And so agriculture began as a way of creating a sustainability of larger populations. And this is when the world began to change. This was at some point, as agriculture grew, a couple of things happened. One was the creation of written language, because now this also was corresponding to a division of labor that said, all y'all got to go work in the field today. And you folks work in the kitchen, and you folks do this, and you folks do that. And so we created these classes of people, occupational classes, sort of like. But also, then, we were dependent on having fairly substantial pieces of land or property that were consistent from year to year. And ultimately, that ended up being that there was a certain family or person who was the owner of the land. And that's where things really went south. Because now the lard who kept the larder, and seriously, this is the linguistic this is the background of the word Lord, is the landowner, the patron. And everyone else served at the discretion of the Lord. And we became serfs. There became a handful of lords and a whole lot of serfs. And we entered, as humanity, into an era of dependency. The serfs were dependent upon the lord's largesse and good feeling to stay alive. If you fell into disfavor with the Lord, your life would probably end fairly quickly. That's the way it evolved. So we were seriously in a state of dependency. And then somewhere around the middle of the 18th century, there was birthed by philosophers a new way of thinking, new ideas that caught fire and infiltrated the mass mind, and it was the sense of this longing for independence. How do we get out from under the thumb of the Lord, or the king, or the emperor? And so independence became the rallying cry of peoples around the globe. And then we began to develop forms of economies and government that were ostensibly set up to allow individuals to fend for themselves and become as wealthy, happy, useful as they wanted to be or were capable of. And those who lacked sufficient desire or wherewithal or capacity or talent, that was the collateral damage, because they had every opportunity, in theory, to succeed, to become as wildly successful as they wanted to be. And so for some, this new model worked out very well. But there was still the lingering momentum, inertia of the old feudal systems that were in play, because we still had landowners, and now we began to have business owners and ultimately factory owners who depended upon a subservient, docile, and obedient workforce to continue their enterprise. And then the model also came into being of profitability. I want to not only be sustained by my enterprise, I want to begin to accumulate wealth in such a way that I can imitate that old feudal model of the Lord. I can be the Lord. This, by the way, has been defined by some as the American dream. I can be the Lord. I can have everything I want in life. And we began to chase materialism, consumerism. And this model is way more complex than that, and we could spend days analyzing it, but at its root, that's kind of what it is. But it was an exercise in the opportunity, at least, for some level of independence. One of my favorite movies of all time is a movie called Jeremiah Johnson. And it's Robert Redford playing the character who was in the Civil War and was so traumatized by the brutality of the Civil War that when the war was over, he packed up his stuff on his trusty horse and headed for the Rocky Mountains so that he could be away from humanity, could live totally independently. And he was somewhat successful in that, except there were other human beings up in the Rocky Mountains, and he had to interact with them, as well as animals who had primacy in the Rocky Mountains that they didn't have in the plains or the lowlands, such as grizzly bears and the like. And so the movie is all about his adventure of surviving in the wild as a totally independent human being. It's an interesting study. Because by the end of the movie, even though he's had great success, he's somewhat subdued in his presentation. He's a little bit beaten down by the struggle of it. There was a book that was popular many, many years ago called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Do you remember who the author was?
Napoleon Hill. Napoleon?
No.
Stephen Covey.
Stephen Covey, thank you. Stephen Covey wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And Stephen Covey later wrote that this human species is evolving. I said that in a seminar once in Macon, Georgia. And you should have seen the evaluation sheets at the end of the day. Seminar leader was talking about evolution, for which there is no evidence, and blah, blah, blah. It just went on and on and on. But at any rate, humans are evolving. We're not the same creatures we were 10,000 years ago. And in that, Covey says, in that evolution, we are going through certain stages of consciousness. The first stage is dependency. We are all born dependent. As babies, if we did not have other humans attending us, we would perish, plain and simple. So we're born into dependency. And then, if we have effective parents, whatever that means, we are somehow cultured, curried, encouraged, groomed, supported into becoming independent. This was my father's greatest fear, is that he would raise a son so weak, so incapable, that he would not survive a cruel world, that I would not be capable of being independent, of being strong, willful, and able to exert my will upon the world. So independence is the next stage. And so humans have in some ways evolved from feudal times till modern times, from a state of dependency into a state of independence. But Covey says that is, now we could argue all day about how valid that is, because like I said, it's a rather complex model, and you can make the argument that we're still dependent. But Covey says that that is not the end of human evolution. Independence is not the end. The next phase is interdependence. Ironically, right where we started from. However, he said you cannot get from dependence to interdependence without going through independence. Because in dependency, we're weak. In interdependency, we're strong, but vulnerable. The vulnerability that comes from a knowing of self and a knowing of strength and a knowing of capacity. So that when we know ourselves, we know what our strengths are. We're not worried about, how people are whether they're gonna see me as a braggart or what. I know what I'm good at, and I know what I'm not good at. So in an interdependent relationship among humans, I'm going to provide that which I'm good at, and I'm going to accept help with that which I'm not good at from other people in the community who are good at what I'm not good at. That's interdependency. But it comes from a place of strength. So we talk a lot in here about the fact that if you want to see change in the world, it has to start from within. And it starts from within when we start to realize the creative impact we have on our reality. And we talk a lot in here about how to gain the efficacy of being a conscious creator. And so in the following of that path or that challenge, there can be a sense that it's all about me. And in reality, it is and it isn't, because now we've reached the limits of language, because language is binary. Me being a conscious creator is going to impact everyone around me. And everyone around me being a conscious creator is going to impact me. Actually, we impact each other whether we're conscious about it or not. So the call to consciousness is not a call to becoming the Lord. It's not a beacon for the American dream. It's a call to being effective and aware enough to really be part of a truly interdependent community. Now, in the 1960s, these notions abounded, and many folks tried to go back to the tribal model, communes, and almost every one of them ultimately failed by any rational measure of success. And it was because, not because the model was flawed, it was because humans were not sufficiently evolved to live in that manner. There was still the egoic mind and the fear that it's based in that kept jumping in and creating conflict in these new tribal situations. And Norman Mailer said it just like that many years ago. The author Norman Mailer, he said, communism is the best form of government and economy. The problem with it is humans are not sufficiently evolved to live that way. Because we've got this, I want to do my thing. I want to do my thing. James Brown. James Brown did his thing, but he left a wake of destruction in his path. Doing my thing, absolutely. But doing my thing at a level of consciousness that can, in its very nature, take into account the welfare of the whole. It's just like the cells in our body. The cells in our body, each one taken by itself, put in the right environment, can continue to thrive. But these cells ultimately die because there's no purpose. Cells operating in concert create organs, create organ systems, create beings. And there are many economists that say if we want to have a really effective economy that allows people the freedom to be themselves while at the same time operating in a way that the most people benefit the most, it will come in that same model as the cells in an organism that operate each independently but operate with the prime directive of supporting the being. And we've talked in here before about how when we give cells mixed messages, they can become frustrated and say, I don't understand the plan, I'm just going to do my thing. And when cells say, I want to do my thing, we call that cancer. But when the cells are getting a relatively ordered set of commands and are being given the kind of nourishment, both nutritionally and emotionally, to function at an optimum level, cancer will not be an issue. So, and I can already hear them. I had cancer, or I know somebody had cancer, and so you're saying I'm responsible for my own cancer. I'm going, back away from the tribunal. It's not your fault. There's no fault. No blame. I like that in the I Ching. My favorite phrase in the I Ching is no blame. No blame. It just is. It's a fact. It's like a natural law. If we are able to give cells an environment in which to operate that is healthy and consistent, and we feed them consistent information and true information, the cells will operate the way they were designed and in concert, and we will be healthy individuals. But we mess this up. We mess this up because we engage in so much fantasy about reality. We feed false information to the cells because we interpret the meaning of the events of our lives, the sensations that we experience. We give meaning to all those sensations, and sometimes that meaning is valid, but often it's invalid or it's perverted by the emotional filters and conceptual filters that we run it through. So, the goal to being the healthy individual with the capacity to allow consciousness to grow in a way that helps us become a piece ready for interdependence, we have to get clear about the actual integrity of the information system that we've developed that feeds ourselves. All right, so time for a story. Long ago and far away, in a small rural community, there was a church, and the church lost its minister. New minister shows up, hired by the board. The new minister is a remarkable human being. She is absolutely a woman of honor, and her word is always 100% true. We've talked about this before. So, meaning when she says, I'm going to do this, she does it. When she says, I believe this, she believes it. She's 100% committed to truth. And as a result, she spoke truth, and as a result, the congregation grew. And one day, people noticed that the congregation had grown so much that the church would no longer hold them all. They were streaming out into the parking lot, trying on their toes, trying to listen. And so the minister said, all right, it's time for us to create a capital campaign to build an addition onto the church to increase our capacity. Now, there were two brothers who were members of the church. They were vile, they were evil. They were businessmen who were the most corrupt individuals you can imagine. And they were cruel to their family, they were cruel to their customers, they were cruel to their vendors, they were just cruel people. One of the brothers dies. The other brother comes to the minister and says, all right, here's the deal. You've got this $10 million capital campaign. I'm going to write you a check for the entire amount of the capital campaign on one condition. When you preside at my brother's funeral tomorrow, you have to say he was a saint. So the minister had to consider this for a moment. She checked in with her guidance and she looked at the man and she said, deal. Deal done. Next day, the funeral. She begins her oration. This man in the casket was an evil man. He was awful. In business, he was cruel to his vendors, to his customers. He beat his wife. He beat his children. He was one of the most useless, vile, ugly, contaminated human beings that's ever walked the planet. But compared to his brother over here, he was a saint. The value of truth, the value of your word. How many times do we, no exception to this, we give our word to others or to ourselves and cannot keep it? We're creating a web of untruth, and it sucks our energy from us. Do you know how much energy it takes to sustain a lie over time? If I tell the truth always, I don't have to spend any energy remembering the stories that I told. If I'm if I'm making stuff up, if I'm fibbing, then I have to remember the fib I told, so the next time I'm on that subject, I can tell stories that sustain that fib. I don't contradict myself. And so each one of those stories now takes energy to sustain it in memory. And at the end of the day, we're depleted because we have not been in integrity with our word. If we're going to move to the fifth dimension of consciousness, where we are truly capable of being totally interdependent, strong, conscious creators that create in communion, with the people around us and the species globally. It begins with our own integrity. And our own integrity begins with our word. And so as we give our word, let us listen as we give it. Let us take note of the promises we make to others and especially to ourselves. Because in the sustaining of our word, we return to innocence. And in our return to innocence, we come into communion with our true nature. And only in the acting of consciousness through the knowing of our true nature can we be truly effective citizens in the body of cells, in the body of humanity. So something for contemplation. Integrity of my word and how it impacts not only my life but the world at large. Good night, Mrs. Drapkin, wherever you